Well, it was bound to happen sooner or later. In other words, it's not a complete surprise. It is a possibility that has long been whispered about in seminary halls, at clergy lunches, at denominational meetings. It's just few of us really thought it would ever come to fruition. To be clear, any preacher worth their salt prepares every fall to see a little attrition from those who worship at the altar of the gridiron. But we have learned, some of us the hard way, that so long as we keep the service to basically an hour, get people out in time, people can get church out of the way and still be home in time for the day's main event. It was a little harder, of course, when Emily and I were serving our first church in Chicago, as those games could start at noon, which meant that if the service was going a little long, you started to see some hairy eyeballs, some tap watching, some restless moving in the crowd. Of course, we've always known that if you have tickets to the game, all bets are off, even for the non-Methodists. That is, if you have to choose between the tickets to the game and church, it's really easy to see which one is going to win out. The point is, church and the National Football League have always had a sort of uneasy truce. You do your thing, we do our thing. But it is not usual. In fact, not until today have we had to compete directly with an NFL game. I wonder what the score is now. I wonder what's happening out there in the London stratosphere. I wonder if people in Jacksonville are staying home from church today. We can sort of understand the split attention, can't we? Now, for those who are watching from around the country, we recognize that maybe you've already experienced this phenomenon. Maybe you have already seen your team of choice play at some place overseas, and therefore in the early time that conflicted directly with church. But this is a first for the people of Rochester. This is the first time that we have had to figure out whether we will go to church or watch the game. How interesting to find ourselves here. Makes it sort of hard to concentrate on the sermon, doesn't it? We can understand the split attention. After all, we have a lot invested in these teams, don't we? Sure, it's not rational. If aliens were to land and we had to explain to them why we care so much about these men who dress up in pads and wear helmets and bump into each other to move this oblong ball down the field, it likely wouldn't make all that much sense. And yet there's something about it that we love. Not all of us, but many of us. There is something compelling. There's nothing quite like watching your team pitted against another team. And as much as we try to repress those spectator of the gladiator impulses that we have in us, nonetheless, the moment we see that big hit, we are standing up and cheering. The moment we see that ball cross the line, we are jumping up and down. And the moment we see a fumble, we are lamenting, where there's weeping and gnashing of teeth. The point is, we care. For whatever reason, we care about the 17 games that they play each year, plus hopefully a few more in the playoffs. We care about the fumbles and touchdowns and receptions and interceptions. We care about the players and the coaches and the glorious storylines. Just think of what happened with Damar Hamlin last year. In fact, we care so much that we put up flags in our yards. We put on Bills gear when we go out. We wear hats and shirts and sweatshirts. We put bumper stickers on our cars. We even dress our babies in blue and red and white. And when we see another Bills fan, when we are all decked out, we can't help but have a kind of call and response. Go Bills, go Bills. Is there anything else in our lives besides sports that happens with? If it does, it's certainly not church. Sure, there may be a few people who wear Jesus hats or Jesus sweatshirts, and I've seen a few Jesus bumper stickers, but they're not the ones I would want on my car. The point is, they're just different. And football and church are not mutually exclusive, even today. Chances are high that many of those who are watching the game right now will tune in the service a little bit later on once they're secure in the knowledge of the Bills' victory. Once they know everything that's happened, then they'll tune it in, hopefully in a really good mood, ready to hear the sermon or watch the service, or maybe they'll pull up the podcast. Maybe there are even those at home right now who are trying to literally split their attention, the multitaskers among us who have the Bills game on in the background and church up on their computer, or vice versa, and they're trying to find their way. There might even be a few people out there who are here today trying to do the same. God bless you all. And it would be really easy for the preachers among us to stand up and chastise people for whatever decision they made this morning, the game or church. But the truth is, it's not just football that is keeping people away from church this morning, or any other Sunday morning. There's plenty of other things to do with your Sunday morning. You could sleep in, or read the paper, or go to the farmer's market, or have a fancy brunch, or practice your juggling. I don't know. I have to work on Sundays. But there's no lack of things for people to do, and increasingly, people are choosing to do those. Maybe you've seen the statistics like I have. Fewer and fewer people these days are going to church, particularly young people. And if I'm really honest, that is the conversation more often happening in seminary halls, at clergy lunches, and in denominational meetings. And we have no shortage of places to look to cast the blame. We have lots of finger pointing that happens when that comes. People point to everything from youth sports to farmers markets to, today, football. But all that finger pointing is really to avoid taking a hard look in the mirror and being honest with ourselves, which is that people are not going to church because they don't care. It's because we haven't given them a whole lot to care about. That is, we haven't given people a whole lot of reason to try coming to church. To be clear, I still think there are fantastic reasons to come to church. We gather together each week to worship the God of grace made known in Jesus Christ, a God who is standing with arms wide open and pointing us over and over again in the direction of life, pointing all of us in the direction of life, all of us, young and old, black and white, gay and straight, male and female, rich and poor, broken and whole, Republican and Democrat, trans and cis, and everyone beyond and between. That is the God that we gather each week to praise and to lift up and to worship. It's just that that is not the God that every church lifts up. No, at some point in our history, we replaced the one true God with a kind of selfie, only not of our best perspective. We made God in our own image, but not the parts that we like of ourselves. A God of fear, a God of pain, a God of exclusion, a God who is pushing people away instead of bringing people in. Maybe we've heard of that God in some churches. That is, of course, the God that's pushing people out because of the way that they love. That God that is pushing people out because they dare to believe the truth of science, as if there was any question that where there is truth, there is God. That is, of course, the God that is asking you to vote one way, that is asking you to look one way, that is asking you to think one way. If that was the God that I thought we gathered every Sunday to worship, I'd be watching the game too. Not just today, but every Sunday. The very first commandment is to have no other gods. And typically when we hear that read so beautifully today, typically when we hear that, we check a box and think, okay, move on. Clearly we're not worshiping the Babylonian god Baal. But maybe we should stop for at least a moment to consider where it is that we give our devotion. Like if we were to do an audit of our time, how we spend our time, our money, our efforts, our energy, where would be the place that receives most of our devotion? Where would be the place that receives most of yours? So when we talk about not putting any other gods before God, we're not simply saying come to church. We're saying think about the way that you spend your life and consider what it is that you are giving your time, your money, your effort, your energy to, figuring out where it is that you are appointed and asking, does that thing, whatever it is, give you life? Because that, of course, is the second commandment. Don't have any false idols. And while we think, oh, of course I'm not going to have any false idols, then we pick out that little idol that we carry around with us and just check to make sure we know the score. It's not limited, of course, to our smartphones. We've all made false idols in our life. Anything in your life that promises life that it doesn't actually have to give, that, of course, is a false idol. We know what they are: money, sex, position, power, rank, grades, whatever it is in your life that you've put forward and you've invested your time, effort, and energy and convinced that it will give you life. That, of course, is the false idol, and maybe the warning is to let it go. The third commandment is to not take the Lord's name in vain, which relates, of course, to those first two. That is, don't call something God that is not. We don't have to look very far in our world to find that which people call divine, which is not. And if we're struggling to find those things in our own life, maybe we ought to pay attention to the fourth commandment, that is to honor the Sabbath. To take a moment every now and then, once a week, to think about what's happening in our life and to make sure we're still pointed in the right direction. See, we've always thought about the Sabbath as like something we earned, as if it's PTO, right? Or this earned time off that we have. But it's not. We don't take Sabbath because we've earned it. It's not there to celebrate all that we have done. It is there to consider what God is doing, to pause every once in a while to make sure that we're still focused in the right direction, to remind us over and over again that we are more than our work, that we matter not because of what we do, but because of who we are. And that we could do absolutely nothing. We could fail at everything we ever try, and we would still matter. You still matter, and we need a moment to remind ourselves of that over and over again. So we honor the Sabbath and keep it holy. And we do that together because sometimes we only get by with a little help from our friends. Sometimes we need people in our lives who are going to keep pointing us in the direction of life and making sure that we have someone to check against. That's the value of coming to church. We come not because we're perfect, but because we recognize that we are more perfect together than we are apart. Though don't get me wrong, churches themselves have false idols. We've seen them, haven't we? That false idol of tradition, that false idol of dogma, that false idol of we've never done it that way before. And yet we are more perfect together than we are apart. And we need people in our lives to point us in the right direction. We could keep going through all of the 10 Commandments, but I know you all have a game to watch, so let me just say this. Jesus already narrowed it down to 2. He took all of those commandments, recognized how they were connected to one another, and he narrowed it down to 2. Maybe you remember his way of doing it. He said, there are 2 commandments. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and all your mind and all your soul and all your strength. And the second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself. the double love commandment. He took all of the 10 and made them 2, and eventually by the Gospel of John made them 1. I give you a new command, that you love one another. Maybe he recognized that if we love God, we can't help but love our neighbor. If we love our neighbor, we can't help but be loving God, that they are mutually intertwined, because love is an act of worship. And that in the act of love, we connect one another to life, and that life comes through God, who is love. Do you see how these work together? We are finding life through this act of worship, which is an act of love. Together, we are finding our way to love one another, to experience what it's like, and then take it out, having practiced it here and living it in the world. If the church, of course, could remember that, well, we just might have something that people would bother showing up for on Sunday morning. But the good news is that even if they never showed up on Sunday morning, if we were living a life of love, our whole life would be an act of worship. And they could move every single NFL game to Sunday morning. And while the pews might be empty, the true church would be full. That, of course, is my dream. And until then, maybe it helps to show up on Sundays to find our way. See you next week. Amen.